Hi there, and greetings. I'm Matt Sparke, and I'm very honored to have been invited to present this lecture to the Global Studies Department at UC Irvine. I hold your department in high esteem, and I'm just very sorry I can't be down the coast with you in Irvine today or whenever you're watching this recorded lecture. One upside of it being a recorded lecture, nonetheless, is that you can fast forward through the boring bits, and you can also review bits that seem unclear. The bits that seem especially unclear, I look forward to talking to you about in the Q&A, and I'm excited to see what responses this talk generates because it's part of a larger article and book project I'm engaged in. So my title today is COVID and the Death Spiral of Neoliberalism, from rollback vulnerabilities and rollout resilience to rollover ruination, question mark. So let me start by explaining where I got the term neoliberal death spiral from. Initially, this was inspired by some actual animated spiral graph diagrams created by my geography colleague, Danny Dorling, who's a professor of geography at the University of Oxford, and who has on his website for his new book, Slowdown, a series of animated graphs depicting the deaths per day from COVID and whether they're increasing or not on the x-axis and their average number per day on the y-axis. And these graphs generated a kind of a spiral effect that showed how quickly or slowly particular countries were getting the pandemic under some kind of seeming control in the early months of 2020. Since that time, Dorling's stopped producing these graphs on his website, a sign, it seems, that many of these countries have lost control of the pandemic and have not been able to reduce the deaths per day, and instead of seeing these spiraling out of control. I want to segue from this initial inspiration to two key interpretations of death spiral that I want to bring to this talk. The first I'm going to spend most of the time on, and that's the deaths due to COVID as a neoliberal disease. And I basically want to make an argument to you today that we can usefully conceptualize why COVID has been so devastating by looking closely at the way in which it has advanced co-pathogenically in and with neoliberalization processes and the outcomes of neoliberalism, in particular country contexts. In this way, COVID has at once exposed and exploited the weaknesses of market rule. The other death of neoliberalism that I want to turn to, or the other death I want to turn to at the end, is the death of neoliberalism as a topic, a speculative topic. And I want to basically ask the question, has this pandemic revealed so much devastation associated with neoliberal policies and practices that it has finally perhaps led the world to a point where neoliberal ideology, neoliberal policymaking is widely questioned and replaced? So I'm going to turn to that at the end. But first, I want to spend most of the time looking at how we can conceptualize COVID as a form of neoliberal disease. Now, in doing so, I'm turning in part to a metaphor that's been widely used by social theorists to make sense of neoliberalism. Ulrich Beck, back in 2000, referred to neoliberalism as a globalizing thought virus, using the metaphor of a virus to metaphorize neoliberalism. And Jamie Peck, in a number of different places, also a geographical colleague of mine, refers to neoliberalism and theorizes neoliberalism as a kind of disease. He says that neoliberalism both occupies and draws energy from its various host organisms, but it cannot ultimately live entirely without or outside them. Understanding the effects of such parasitical infections and mutations must involve the diagnostic study of many patients, not just a few of the more or less susceptible to the deregulatory bug. In a more complaining article in 2012, Loic Wacquant complained that Foucauldian theories of neoliberal governmentality are, quote, overpopulated with proliferating institutions, all seemingly infected by the neoliberal virus. In that sense, Wacquant was using the metaphor of neoliberalism as a virus to complain that his fellow social theorists and sociologists in particular were seeing it everywhere in a somewhat paranoid way, as one might see a pandemic everywhere in a fairly paranoid way. But nevertheless, Wacquant's solution to this problem of overdiagnosis was actually fairly similar to Jamie Peck's, namely that we need to study more cases of the neoliberal virus. And by looking at those patient cases closely, so he suggested we can do a better job of avoiding overdiagnosis. From this train of thought, I want to step forward to the prospect of studying the millions of cases of COVID as cases of neoliberalism, of what Peck refers to as actually existing neoliberalism. That's one of the implications of this line of argument. I'm going to move my head here so you can see the other points I'm trying to make. I think we also need to research how neoliberalism mutates and evolves as it infects, and COVID provides an opportunity to do just that, to do what Jamie Peck suggested we needed to do, but looking at how it has mutated and evolved co-pathogenically with an actual real-world virus in real-world cases. And that in turn prompts us to study a series of hybridizations of neoliberalism. Now I'm going to explain what I mean by that with my next slide. Jamie Peck, working with a number of colleagues, has suggested that we can theorize at least three types of hybrid formations of actually existing neoliberalism. So looking at how neoliberalism has evolved, how it's mutated in the world at large as it's moved across the body politic of the world, he thinks that we can usefully distinguish these three R's of actually existing neoliberalism: roll back neoliberalism, roll out neoliberalism, and more recently what he has suggestively called rollover neoliberalism. Rollback neoliberalism is the most familiar to the most people. It's the notion of neoliberalism as a deregulatory juggernaut, a policy-making orthodoxy that urges the cutting of red tape on business everywhere, the privatization of public utilities, public controls as well, austerity for public budgets, welfare cuts for the poor, tax cuts for the wealthy and corporations, and structural adjustment programs for indebted poor countries. That's standard issue rollback neoliberalism, and obviously that has taken on various different formats in different contexts. It has itself mutated around the world. But one of the larger mutations that Peck and Tickell pointed out quite early on is a certain form of roll-out neoliberalism that involves the institutionalization of market discipline, the use of rankings and ratings to govern through forms of neoliberal governmentality populations, the use of investment logics and return on investment rules for all kinds of policy programming, as we will see, not least of all in global health, and various forms of personal responsibilization, like those associated with welfare reform in the United States. More recently, trying to make sense of Trumpism and other similar reactionary political movements, ranging from Brexit to the rise of leaders like Orban to Modi in India. Peck et al. Talk about rollover neoliberalism, obviously searching for another R. They hit here upon another kind of idea that's been part of Jamie Peck's work more generally, which is an interest in how neoliberalism often fails, but it fails forward. It kind of falls forward in ways that lead to a form of policymaking persistence. And now it's fallen forward by falling in, as it were, with authoritarianisms, with pro-monopoly regimes that are plutocratic, but are also populist and advance a kind of market rule under the aegis of what's often seen by critics as a fake kind of populism, a kind of populism of Donald Trump. So this offers at least one way of making sense of the hybridization of neoliberalism with right-wing policy making. But as Wendy Brown has suggested in her recent book on the ruins of neoliberalism, there's also the question of whether this rollover moment might actually represent the final ruin of neoliberalism, the final end of actually existing neoliberalism, when we can say that it stopped actually existing. That's the question I want to turn back to at the end of this talk. Now let's look at how these various formations of neoliberalism have come to be tied together with actual forms of disease in the world at large. Well, let's turn, in other words, from the metaphor of neoliberalism as a virus to how it's interacted with various kinds of pathogens, including actual viruses in the world at large. There's a large literature going back to particularly this wonderful book edited by Jim Kim and colleagues from Partners in Health called Dying for Growth. There's a large literature that shows how rollback neoliberalism in the form of austerity and structural adjustment, privatization, and all the rest of it has been tied to poor health outcomes, particularly in poorer countries that have been stuck due to structural adjustment plans with diminished or non-existent health systems. Paul Farmer has been a particularly effective critic of the resulting pathologies of power, as he refers to them in another book, but also infections tied to inequalities that he suggests are associated with the modern plagues in this book I've highlighted here. Rick Rowden's book, The Deadly Ideas of Neoliberalism, makes the case that IMF policies in particular have devastated health across the poorer parts of the world. In the rich world, more recently, David Stuckler and Sanjay Basu argue that the body economic has been transformed by austerity to producing poor health outcomes. And they show how this has happened with a lot of very compelling epidemiological data. So too do Ted Schraker and Claire Bambra make this argument in How Politics Make Us Sick, subtitled Neoliberal Epidemics. And without using the word neoliberalism, the World Health Organization itself, informed by research by folks like Ted Schraker, but Ronald Labonte and many others, has pointed out in a really comprehensive 2008 report, Closing the Gap in a Generation, how around the world the forms of inequalities and insecurities tied to neoliberal reform have led to devastating health outcomes. So there's a lot of evidence that rollback neoliberalism has co-pathogenically led to global ill health. But there's another movement I want to suggest through which uh, neoliberalism and global health have come to be related. In response to many of the poor health outcomes I've just mentioned, associated with neoliberal cutbacks and austerity around the world, all sorts of new global health initiatives have been advanced as forms of intervention. Global health initiatives often sponsored by philanthro-capitalist organizations such as the Gates Foundation. And here we see forms of rollout neoliberalism playing a role in shaping global health policy making. In other words, the kind of compensatory double movement that Polanyian theorists have talked about in response to earlier rounds of market savagery has in our own time led to a pushback, a roll out in response to rollback neoliberalism. But that pushback has been shaped by neoliberal norms of accountability, neoliberal norms of governmentality. Salman Khashoggi's book, Blind Spot, How Neoliberalism Infiltrated Global Health, is a good argument about how this happened, focusing on where he was involved in, as a physician on the front lines, working with an NGO in Tajikistan. Joanna Crane, in her book Scrambling for Africa, points to similar neoliberal governmentality logics, turning global health policy making and programming by wealthy US universities in Africa into a somewhat parasitical operation. And to give you a really close up sense of what I'm referring to here as the neoliberalization of global health policy making, take a look at this front cover of Impact magazine put out by PATH, DevX, and some other health NGOs in the early 2000s. This was issued as the best buys issue of Impact magazine, and it had the subtitle Where to Invest in Global Health in 2014. It gives you a sense of how a kind of Fortune 500 kind of logic, a way of thinking about global health as a series of investments, has come to shape the thinking about how to do global health in NGO circles. In my own article in Ripe that came out last year, I make the case that this kind of neoliberalization of global health policy making really can be seen as a kind of double movement that has worked in tandem with roll back neoliberalism. So the two things need to be understood as wired to one another. But in making this argument, I don't want to imply that all forms of global health biopolitics can be reduced to just neoliberal logics. In this respect, I follow the example of theorists like Melinda Cooper, whose brilliant book, Family Values, shows how neoliberalism in the United States has been closely interarticulated with neoconservatism. But you don't understand that hybrid formation very well if you reduce everything to just neoliberalism. You need to see how the two formations are tied to one another in a conjunctural way, to use that Stuart Hall term. Some recent scholarship on COVID has illustrated in turn how we can bring that kind of conjunctural analysis to looking at COVID as at once a neoliberal disease, but also a set of pathologies that are explained in relationship to other social structures like structural racism and patriarchy and the prison complex. And Patricia Lopez and Abigail Neely suggest that the fundamentally uncaring aspects of neoliberalism have been twinned with logics of neglect, not logics of exemption and exception that have targeted particularly racialized minorities for being abandoned in the context of the pandemic. And that's the kind of conjunctural analysis I think is important to avoid reducing everything to neoliberalism. But let's turn now to looking at COVID itself as an actually existing neoliberal disease. In this respect, I think we can identify at least three particular ways in which neoliberalism has become co-pathogenic in the context of the pandemic. It's clearly inhibited public health protections and responses. It's also increased infection and vulnerability. And more fundamentally, at a molecular level, we can also trace the incubation of the actual virus to certain forms of neoliberal market rule in China. In this sense, I think we also can come to terms with the COVID as a neoliberal disease by looking at it conjuncturally in relationship to the sort of overdetermination of rollback neoliberalism, roll out neoliberalism, and roll over neoliberalism, all coming together and merging causally to shape our experience of the pandemic. So let me expand on this by going through each of these 3 points one by one. So let's start with the inhibiting of public health protections and responses. And this has happened most obviously ideologically through the relentless privileging of economic liberty over concerns with mortality and morbidity in more neoliberal regimes. So in countries where this sort of hegemonic ideology of neoliberalism, of advancing, privileging economic liberty over everything else is most advanced, we've seen the most strident resistance by politicians and publics to the idea that we should lock down the economy or shelter in place in order to protect public health. Some research done by University of Oxford scholars on levels of government stringency in response to the pandemic show how the UK and the United States have, as it were, been behind the curve compared to China, France, Italy, and South Korea in the speed with which they've advanced more stringent responses. And one can analyze that slowness to respond in part as an outcome of the privileging of economic liberty. But this is just at a policy-making, more ideological level. There are institutional ways rollback neoliberalism has inhibited public health protections, not least of all through the privatized hospital systems and insurance systems that Americans depend on, and in other countries where they have dominated all around the world, the results have been found inadequate, and hospital systems have been found incapacitated when their whole for-profit model has not been able to shift over to dealing with the pandemic. They've lost clinical revenues, obviously, because of other treatments and processes not happening. At the same time, they've been hit by the need to provide ICU space for COVID patients. Hollowed out market states around the world have in turn been unable to address that shortfall, and more generally have been found wanting as they try and outsource the responses to provinces and states and to market players of various kinds. States that have taken a less neoliberal approach haven't approached it through outsourcing and have taken more central governmental control, have done better against COVID. Roll-out neoliberalism has also been very visible in the pandemic, with responses being reduced to personal resilience all over the place, where many members of the public have been told that their only solution is hand washing, wearing homemade masks, using apps, and relying on personal entrepreneurial strategies such as finding luxury escapes or finding jobs that provide for remote work. Certainly, our dependency on the rolling out of vaccines and diagnostics and treatments for COVID by for profit pharmaceutical firms, that dependency has been shown throughout the pandemic and looks set to continue to overshadow global access to vaccines, a point that I'll return to in a moment. The limits, particularly in poor countries in vaccine access, look set to be very painfully felt because of the inadequacies of a philanthrocapitalist response mechanism. In Geneva, Gavi and COVAX and CEPI are all trying to coordinate this charity model response where basically richer countries are donating or paying for vaccines for poorer countries. But it's clear that there won't be enough, and there's an unwillingness to override patents and to issue compulsory licenses that ironically this charity model approach is entrenching. It's almost as if taking a charity model approach to providing vaccines for the poor is immunizing the global supply system for vaccines and other drugs from a more radical response that would be based on issuing compulsory licensing and creating vaccines in government-run or government-commandeered factories. The only kind of nationalistic control we've seen, by contrast, is that associated with rollover neoliberalism, with vaccine nationalism without compulsory licensing acting as a kind of pincer alongside this charity model approach to limit access to vaccines by poor countries that don't have the economic clout to get in the queue for pre-purchase agreements. The other way we've seen rollover neoliberalism activated and damaging in the pandemic is through market fundamentalist appeals to herd immunity, including in the so-called Great Barrington Declaration, sponsored by the Koch brothers Institute, which basically makes the case that we should let the virus rip and sacrifice people at will in the name of keeping the economy going. And Koch-sponsored American Institute for Economic Research has celebrated political leaders who've taken this position, including the governor of South Dakota, Kristi Noem, celebrating her as making South Dakota a fortress of liberty and hope, protected from the grasps of overbearing politicians. And this presaging a subsequent devastating acceleration of the pandemic in South Dakota, where liberty and hope turned into mortality and despair for all too many of the state's citizens. So all three formations of neoliberalism, theorized by Peck and colleagues, can be seen at work in the pandemic. Let's look at each one now in turn. In relationship to increasing infection and vulnerability, the impact of each one, rollback neoliberalism, rollout neoliberalism, and rollover neoliberalism, has been clear. Infection rates have been increased by lack of sick leave, lack of unemployment security, and lack of job site protections for so-called essential workers, exposing them to more infection and spreading the virus. Throughout 2020, rollback neoliberalism was also implicated in the lack of protection equipment for hospital workers, and also in the lack of adequate staffing numbers and the exposure of so many healthcare workers, particularly in aged care facilities, and a lack of adequate public housing, also something that can be traced back to rollback neoliberalism, has led many people in states like California to be living in crowded dorms, worker dorms, or in countries in the global south to be living in slums where and in various informal settlements where the spread of the pandemic has taken off as a result. Rollout neoliberalism has increased infection and vulnerability in a variety of ways too. It's heightened dependency on privatized food supply systems and increased food insecurity, particularly in poor country contexts like India. It's led to a dependency on central bank interventions as a response to the economic hits that the pandemic has created. And these interventions have obviously done much more to protect stock market portfolios rather than actual people. The US stock market is all-time high as we continue to see 3,000 deaths per day in the United States at the moment. And the rollout neoliberalism has also created a dependency on a disease-specific global health agency ecosystem in places like Geneva, which knows how to go after a subset of big name diseases, AIDS, TB, and malaria in particular, but has created such a kind of narrowed investment logic driven focus on those diseases, it's unable to provide the health systems that are needed in the context of a pandemic like COVID to actually provide wraparound care for people when they don't have one of those big three diseases, but they have some but when their community is suffering from a problem that needs a strong health system to provide testing, contact tracing, and vaccine rollout. None of those things are made easy if you've created a global health supply system that's only focused on three big diseases. And rollover neoliberalism has been implicated in all sorts of heightened risk of infection and vulnerability in the pandemic, not least of all the exclusion and disregard of immigrants and homeless people in COVID hotspots. California prison system is another COVID hotspot that has been particularly damaging in the context of the pandemic, and a place of abandonment by a society that regularly sacrifices large swaths of the population to incarceration and exemption from the inclusion in the neoliberal logic of fostering entrepreneurial subjects and so forth. Maybe another argument can also be made that rollover neoliberalism is implicated in the growth of things like the anti-vax movement, where the creation of media monopolies and disinformation has in turn bred this virus of doubt and languages of calling COVID a scam and so forth that have recently been held aloft at Dodger Stadium in Los Angeles by anti-vaxxers who are trying to stop seniors from getting vaccinated from COVID. Let me finally turn to the incubation of the actual virus. And here I just want to refer to the excellent work of Rob Wallace and his colleagues, who have brought together expertise in microbiology with political economic analysis to show how on the market frontiers around the world, what we are breeding under general neoliberal conditions, all sorts of new viruses and disease threats. Wallace and colleagues talk about developing a general theory of neoliberal disease emergence, and they apply it to many diseases, not just to COVID. They have written some excellent work on Ebola as a neoliberal disease as well. This, but they've turned more recently to COVID in a terrific article that came out in Monthly Review early in 2020. Here they offer an antidote to a Orientalist geography of blame that would blame Wuhan and China specifically and depict COVID as Kung flu or China virus as President Trump did. Instead, they focus on world food commodification and how it is increasingly integrated and formalized and financialized alongside the commodity chains of industrialized livestock rearing that have been created to feed the proletariat, as it were, of big Chinese cities like Wuhan. They argue in this article that the overlapping economic geography extends back from the Wuhan market to the hinterlands where exotic and traditional foods are raised by operations bordering the edge of contracting wilderness. Industrial production encroaches on the last of the forest, wild food operations must cut further in to raise their delicacies or raid the last stands. As a result, the most exotic of pathogens, in this case bat-hosted SARS-2, find their way onto a truck, whether in food animals or the labor tending them, shotgun from one end of a lengthening peri-urban circuit to the other before hitting the world stage. So this is their general theory of neoliberal disease emergence in action. And we can look forward to more work by Rob Wallace and his colleagues that continues to look at the variants of COVID that are emerging right now, some of which he argues are associated with the toggling on and off of lockdown controls associated with neoliberal pushback to public health measures. Now I want to turn, having summarized all these co-pathogenic interactions between neoliberalism and COVID, I want to ask the question, will the ruins created by neoliberal disease lead to enough disease with actually existing neoliberalism that it stops actually existing? That's my big question. But following in the footsteps of people like Colin Crouch and more recently Wendy Brown, it seems unlikely that this will happen. So my answer is largely negative. We're seeing a corporate rollout of the vaccine. We're seeing a focus on drones and wearables as ways for the wealthy to cope in the pandemic. We're seeing philanthro-capitalist palliatives offered to the poor. Further down the horizon, we're looking at a global return to fiscal austerity and retrenchment. And people like Larry Summers are already coming back into the fore to argue that even Biden's efforts to keep the US economy alive are risking inflation. And you can very well see how people like Summers are going to overshadow efforts to keep economies going around the world in the years ahead. And the sort of anti-democratic trends we've seen and all their associated signs of big money shaping politics, particularly big money provided by monopolists shaping politics, all of that looks set to intensify, risking more of the anti-democratic politics in the West that Wendy Brown has argued is a final part of the arc of neoliberalism. But I don't want to end here in this talk. Instead, I do want to remind everyone of the signs of community and civil society care that we have seen amidst the pandemic. All across the world and all across California, we've seen communities come together to care for one another, to thank essential workers, and to try to advance treatment, protection, contact tracing, uh, various kinds of testing to people who cannot afford it, who are out of the loop and not who are generally abandoned by privatized hospital systems and the rest of it. And some poorer countries, notably Vietnam, have done a really good job of tackling COVID by taking a community-based approach in conjunction with government control and management. We've also seen movements taking shape more recently to push for so-called freedom for the vaccine. Freeing the vaccine has become the watchword of Universities Allied for Essential Medicines, who've joined up with various other groups, including MSF Access and Jamie Love's group Knowledge Ecology International, to argue that this is the moment to suspend IP rights on private pharmaceutical patents and go beyond the monopoly model in medicine and really go for herd immunity at the only scale that really matters, which is the global scale. The argument's pretty simple and pretty clear to make that if we don't create herd immunity at a global scale, we're going to continue to see variants of COVID evolve and mutate. And as they do so, the drugs produced, the first round vaccines that we are benefiting from, look set to become less effective over time. And the best way to avoid this problem is to try to provide herd immunity at the global level right from the get-go by liberalizing, to turn that language of liberty around, by liberalizing access to the vaccine rather than liberalizing the ability of private pharmaceutical companies to monopolize profits. There are lots of legal tools for doing this, and I look forward to talking to the legal scholars amongst you all in the Q&A about some of these legal tools that can be harnessed to the cause of freeing the vaccine. Thinking like this about reimagining a global health future that's an alternative future post-neoliberalism is an exciting prospect, and it's one that I do think that the pandemic has opened for many people. Arundhati Roy spoke eloquently early on in 2020 about how pandemics open doors to thinking about alternatives. She said that historically pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. That's the place I want to end this talk. The way I'm hoping to collaborate with colleagues at UC Santa Cruz to fight for that better world includes trying to build a global and community health program at UCSC. And that's where my little logo here of a Santa Cruz slug holding open hands with a globe in it and saying Fiat's health, that's where that comes from. And UC Irvine has some interesting connections to make between global studies, critical global studies, and global health. And I look forward to talking to you about those possibilities too in the Q&A. If you got this far in watching me, thanks so much. And I really do look forward to talking to everybody when we meet this coming week. Thanks, everybody, and see you soon. Bye.